The program Dateline Israel.
From Israel and the Middle East, Dateline Israel. Today, Boundaries Against War, with Arnold Forster, author and correspondent.
We're standing on the controversial west bank of the Jordan River, with Israel only miles in front of us, and the east bank of the Jordan in full view in the rear. Because of the 5 wars it has had to fight since it was reestablished in 48, Israel argues that without genuine peace it needs secure and defensible borders here on the Golan Heights and in the Sinai. But the Arabs contend Israel has no right to sit on their lands for such a purpose. We talk about it today with General Chaim Herzog, former chief of Israel military intelligence, once its military governor on this West Bank, and today an internationally recognized military and political analyst of Middle East affairs. What precisely, General Herzog, is a secure and defensible border? How would you define it?
Well, it's a mixture. It's first of all, it's a physical configuration of a border between 2 countries, which enables one country to defend itself the better against the other. But that's oversimplifying, because it also has as a basis also the political background of the relations between the 2 countries. For instance, you have the border between the United States and Canada is a secure and defensible border because of the relations between the countries, and the fact that a war between the 2 countries is unthinkable. Similarly with the Benelux countries in Europe. Now, for instance, the border between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, the Iron Curtain in West Germany, is not defensible from a military point of view, but it's secure and defensible because there happens to be a United States nuclear deterrent behind it.
The concept, then, of a defensible border is not new with Israel.
Oh, certainly not. It exists with every country. And, of course, the basis is the relationship between the 2 countries, first of all, and afterwards the geographical configuration of the terrain.
Physically or geographically speaking, then, General Herzog, which are Israel's main borders which need securing and defensible position?
Well, they're beginning from the south, of course, in the Sinai, which would be a buffer between Israel and Egypt. Then you've got the whole complex of the border with Jordan, which includes the problem of the West Bank. Remember, the border originally ran before 1967 right through the city of Jerusalem. And finally, you've got the border in the Golan Heights, which again used to run along the Jordan River down to the Sea of Galilee, and now runs in the Golan Heights, some 15 miles away from the river, in depth towards Damascus.
Israel occupies all of the Sinai Desert, or at least most of it. That's more than 100 miles deep. Does Israel need it all for defensible borders?
I wouldn't say that it needs it all. Given the present political conditions in which Egypt announces that she is preparing for another war, it needs it all because the bigger the depth. And incidentally, one of the main lessons of the Yom Kippur War is, in fact, that we had strategic depth really saved us.
But Egypt and the world regard the Sinai Desert as Egypt. Doesn't the fact that Israel sits on the Sinai Desert itself become the reason for preventing peace negotiations?
Not at all. Israel is prepared to enter into peace negotiation based on territorial compromise and giving up the Sinai Peninsula. The only problem is what Israel will get in return. And what they're asking for in return is not territory, but just normal relations such as exist throughout the world between 2 self-respecting countries. It took a lot of effort to persuade Israel to move off the Suez Canal back perhaps 15 or 20 miles. Well, it didn't take so much effort. There were negotiations, mutual negotiations, And in return for relieving the Third Egyptian Army, which was cut off, and pulling out of Egypt, the Israelis at that time agreed to give up these advantages that she had and to withdraw, to disengage both sides, to allow the United Nations to come in between, in the hope that this could be the first phase of negotiations for normalizing the relations between Israel and Egypt.
And yet now, General Herzog, Egypt is insisting that there'll be no further political or military agreements with Israel unless it withdraws beyond the Mitla and Gidi mountain passes, which are perhaps 18 miles from the Suez Canal.
Israel is saying that we are prepared to withdraw, that most of Sinai is negotiable, but we are not prepared to withdraw for nothing. In other words, and again, we're not asking for territory, but we are asking for a normalization of relations. We're asking for ordinary trade relations, for the removal of the boycott, for the passage of Israeli ships through the canal. In other words, we're asking for things which are absolutely natural between two self-respecting countries in any other part of the world.
And yet on the other side of the coin, Egypt and the Arab countries are insisting that by sitting on the Sinai Desert with the explanations you offer, that really it's all an excuse for Israeli expansionism.
Well, Israel has no expansionist ambitions. That's one of the stories put out by the Arab world. In fact, the Sinai Peninsula was used 3 times in 27 years as a jumping-off base for attack on Israel. He now is more or less saying, we're prepared to give up the Sinai Peninsula in return for conditions, normal conditions which exist between any two countries in the world.
The problem, General Herzog, is different on the Golan. In the Sinai, you have 100-mile depth. In the Golan, you have a strip perhaps 40 miles long and 15 miles wide. Isn't that a difference?
Well, obviously, it's better than the situation which existed before the 1967 war, when we were sitting here in the valley along the Jordan River. And from the Jordan River, an escarpment rises to the Golan Heights, about 600 feet high, looking down on the Israeli villages in what we call the Finger, that is the northern part of Israel, which they used to artillery fire and even with machine gun fire. The villages, the children grew up in shelter. Now, since the 1967 war, these villages have lived comparatively in peace. And the reason is not because modern weapons can't hit at that distance, but the mere fact that the Israelis are sitting on the heights gives them, first of all, adequate range to deal with the Syrian forces which would be engaging our forces, and say at our villages. And secondly, it creates a deterrent vis-a-vis Damascus. The city of Damascus is in full view of our forces today, and the Syrians are aware of that. And that deterrent element certainly has had a beneficial effect as far as we are concerned.
But General, doesn't the geographic configuration become irrelevant in the face of sophisticated weaponry that can overfly the Golan Heights?
Theoretically, yes. You're quite right. But the fact is that this sophisticated weaponry is two-sided. It's the missiles fly in two directions. It's not a one-way street. And the Arabs, the Syrians, are aware today that any attempt by them to use the missiles against Israeli civilian populations would probably be met with retaliation on the part of Israel against Damascus and other centers of Syrian population. And that, I believe, is the main deterrent.
But Scud missiles, General, with a range of 180 miles, the Syrians can hit Jerusalem and Tel Aviv from well within the Syrian borders.
That's true, but the Syrians are aware of the fact that Israel has a capability, particularly by means of its air force, to strike back at any center of population in Syria, for that matter at any Arab capital, to strike back in the event of these long-range missiles being used against.
Flying the speed of sound Aren't defensible borders an archaic concept?
Not necessarily. For instance, before the 1967 war, Israel was living with the problem of a 4-minute electronic advance notice, 4-minute warning period of grace. Today, with the more sophisticated planes, it probably goes down to 2 to 3 minutes on the basis of the 1967 borders. That is vis-a-vis Egypt. Today, because of the Sinai, that warning period of grace is approximately 4 times. In other words, about 15, 16 minutes, which in terms of modern warfare is a very considerable period.
General Herzog, does Israel consider the West Bank itself to be a defensible border?
The West Bank today, in other words, the Jordan River with the Judean wilderness rising from the Jordan River is definitely of very, very great importance to Israel. You've got to go back to 1967. In 1967, look at the border we had. You had here the Jordanians at Tulkarm here could cut the waist of Israel with, all they had to do was attack from advance for 10 miles in order to cut the waist of Israel.
You mean the width of Israel?
At that point was 10 miles wide to Netanya. Or they had guns here in Kalkilia, which shelled the center of Tel Aviv in 1967. In fact, some of their shells landed 25 yards away from where we are sitting at this moment in 1967. They had only to advance 500 yards here to cut the road to Jerusalem. Inside Jerusalem, they only had to use small arms in order to paralyze the entire city. They didn't have to use artillery or mortars.
General, they're very up close to Jerusalem. Would the Jordanian troops, do you believe, actually shoot at Jerusalem itself?
They've done
shell it?
They've done it twice. They did it in 1948 and destroyed the entire Jewish quarter with all its synagogues and holy places to the Jews in 1948, and nobody in the world raised one protest against it. And again in 1967, they shell the city mercilessly for the period of the fighting, that in any illusions whatsoever about what they would do. What the West Bank has done is given us all this area now as a buffer again, and any Jordanian force which wants to, say, reach the main center of population of Jerusalem has not only to cross the river, but come up here through mountainous territory to rise to a height of 3,000 feet in Jerusalem. In other words, this is very easily defensible from the point of view, the line of mountains here through the West Bank is very easily defensible from the point of view of Israel. And that is why it guarantees the safety of the whole of Israel. There's another point, that with the sophisticated weaponry today, with this surface-to-air missiles, if they had this West Bank today, they could in fact paralyze the entire air activity over Israel.
Supposing the West Bank becomes a new state, a Palestinian state, with its own army and its own air force, what happens to the buffer security that you now have?
If they maintain, after all, the West Bank is due to become a Palestinian state in the eyes of the Arabs under the PLO, under Arafat, which means that they subscribe to a policy of the destruction of Israel. And if that is their policy, then this would mean, in fact, a major move towards the destruction of Israel.
If the West Bank again becomes part of Jordan, does that change the situation?
That does change the situation considerably, provided that there are military safeguards in the agreement with Jordan, which would enable, which would first of all leave the West Bank entirely demilitarized.
If the entire Arab League, General Herzog, wants the West Bank now to be in the hands of the Palestinians and taken away from Jordan, isn't Israel's proposal somewhat unrealistic?
I think I'm talking in practical terms in the context of the Middle East. There's nothing unanimous, there's nothing final in the Middle East.
General Herzog, can there be a secure and defensible border against a PLO terrorist team?
They haven't been very successful. I mean, it's true. If you want to measure success by taking innocent children hostage or killing women and children in the various villages where they perpetrated these atrocities in the north, you can call that is not much of an advance. The Israeli countermeasures have been very effective, as they were incidentally years ago in the Jordan River. We use all the sophisticated elements here. I do not see this as a major problem for Israel.
Does the PLO have a military capacity beyond the so-called, to use your expression, nuisance value of killing innocent women and children?
In my view, it has no military capacity of any degree, to any degree. It's nothing more than a nuisance value, which you've got to deal with. And I believe it can be dealt with. And I personally believe that if Israel strikes back, as she has been striking back, and if she strikes at the centers of these activities, then the problem can be kept within manageable limits.
Recently, you wrote a new book, The War of Atonement. I don't know whether or not it's in English, in which you told the lessons that Israel learned out of the Yom Kippur War. What precisely were those lessons?
Well, the book is being printed in English. It's being published in the United States by Little Brown. And the lessons are manifold. One of them is certainly that the strategic depth which Israel had which Israel obtained in 1967 following the Six-Day War was vital in saving Israel in 1973. And had we listened to our friends and advisors over the years, and they were friends, they were sincere about it, but had we listened to them, we could have been in a very, very perilous situation in October 1973 without strategic depth. And then of course, there are lessons as far as Israel's preparedness and Israel's awareness of what's going on the other side.
During the Yom Kippur War, General Herzog, the problem of military supplies seemed to be most acute. And after the war, the United States began to send massive new military hardware to Israel. Why is the United States so willing to give such costly and vast military equipment to your country?
Because the United States is aware of the fact that Israel is fighting her war. We are in fact in the front line, defending the whole of the Western world today against Soviet imperialism. It's true, everybody talks about détente, but it's one-sided. And in fact, the Russians are not missing any tricks. They're moving rapidly both in this area and certainly in the Persian Gulf. They're mounting a major effort in the Persian Gulf. They've been active wherever they can. They're empiric in their attitude. They're willing to take advantage of any situation. They have everywhere, in fact, taken advantage of situations. And the one element which has stood up to this advance has been Israel. And in this respect, by standing up to this advance and fighting the wars as we've done, we've in fact been saving American lives, unless America wants to become a second-rate nation in the world and not be the leading power in the world. But assuming that the United States realizes her responsibilities as the leading power in the West and in the free world, then Israel has been doing a job for the United States and the free world, which fortunately the United States leadership appreciates.
Then isn't it the fact, General Herzog, if the Soviet Union is similarly supplying Syria with massive military equipment, aren't the two giants using the two little fellas to fight each other? Isn't that what's happening?
To a degree, it is. I wouldn't say the United States is using Israel, because the United States sincerely wants peace in the area and has never planned to use anybody here. But the Soviet Union is definitely using other countries. It talks about détente between the Soviet Union and the United States. And officially, of course, no Soviet forces are involved. There are advisors and so forth. But in fact, it uses other elements in different parts of the world in order to further its own aims. And that's what's happening. And the United States has really awakened to this in the past few years, has strengthened Israel, and has given Israel a defense posture which enables Israel to stand up to it.
Absent an American defense pact, doesn't the whole question of defensible borders nevertheless disappear in face of nuclear power?
Well, there are, thank God, no nuclear weapons in the Middle East, to the best of my knowledge. And if there were, I think if ultimately there were on both sides, I think the effect would be the same as exists today between the United States and the Soviet Union. In other words, a cancelling out, a mutual deterrent.
Despite the existence of defensible borders, are there any circumstances, General Herzog, under which Israel would engage in a preemptive strike?
There's no doubt about it that today Israel is in a position to launch such a strike. In other words, she has achieved the option of launching such a strike. But I personally do not see any circumstances in which Israel would move towards a preemptive strike unless it appeared that a major Arab attack was absolutely imminent. In other words, unless we reached a situation similar to the Yom Kippur War, but this time we'd be ready for it.
Even if it seemed justified on all sides, do you think world opinion would tolerate a preemptive strike?
I don't think world opinion would tolerate a preemptive strike if we just out of the blue suddenly attacked an Arab country. But if with all the concomitant tension, such as we had, say, on the eve of the Six-Day War in 1967, when the whole world was waiting for Israel to be swallowed up by the Kiev, well, just as then the world understood, I think they would understand today. But I personally do not see that.
How long, General, can Israel live under the constant threat of war, actual war, call-ups, mobilizations, terrorist strikes? What happens to the psyche of the Israeli people?
The atmosphere of possible war, the subconscious knowledge that there is always this possibility, exists in Israel all the time. And we've just adapted ourselves to this situation. I think the only difference between us and the rest of the world is that we are aware of the danger facing us, and the rest of the Western world is not aware of the danger, because incidentally the Western world is also facing such a danger, but they're not just aware of it. But it's in many ways, strangely enough, I would say it's, first of all, it's given a country, the nation, cohesion. We could have lived without it, but if it's already there, it's given us cohesion, it's given us a certain national unity, a sense of purpose. We have a wonderful youth, which has not gone the way of the youth in the rest of the world today, primarily because it realized that it's fighting for something, it has something to achieve. The whole atmosphere of willing to achieve, an attempt to achieve something in the country, is in no small measure due also to the pressures from outside. For example, when Arafat was received in this grotesque ceremony of the United Nations, it had a good effect on Israel in many ways, because it unites the country. They realized that we had something to achieve, we had something to stand up against. So I would not say that this whole tension is all entirely negative. On the contrary, we would be only too happy to live without it. And but in the meantime, since there's no alternative, we realize that the only answer is to develop, to increase, to become stronger.
With Israel obviously genuinely interested in peace, how much occupied territory would Israel be willing to surrender to achieve that peace?
People would want to be 100% convinced that what we're talking about is a real peace, a peace such as you have between the United States and Canada, or in the Benelux countries, or in your border with Mexico. Given that, I'm quite sure that there is a preparedness for a great deal of concession on the part of Israel.
In political terms then, General Herzog, what is the most secure and defensible border?
The most secure and defensible border is real peace with the Arab world, a real and sincere peace, a complete change in the Arab attitude in regard to the right of Israel's right to exist, in regard to Israel's right to exist. Given that change, then I believe all the other matters are easily soluble. I don't see any major problem as far as defensible borders, as far as agreed borders are concerned in this area, given a major, sincere change on the part of the Arab world.
Thank you, General Herzog. This is Arnold Forster. My guest, General Chaim Herzog. The program, Dateline Israel.